The glass jar hit the marble counter with a sound that made every head in the bakery turn. Coins rattled and settled. A black man in a faded work jacket stood at the register, his shoulders square, his eyes steady. "I want the enchanted castle," he said. "The one in the display case. It's my daughter's birthday." The manager glanced at the jar, then smiled the kind of smile that carried no warmth at all. "Sir, that cake is $389. Perhaps you'd like to see something more suitable. Now, before we go any further, take a look at that man. Worn shoes, a work jacket with a stitched-up tear on the cuff, a glass jar full of quarters and dimes, and a manager who's already decided he doesn't belong. What would you do if you were standing in his shoes? Would you walk away? Would you fight back? Drop your answer in the comments, because what this man did next is something none of them saw coming. But to understand why he stood there, why his hand rested on that jar like it held something far more valuable than coins, we need to go back 6 months. Harry Reid woke every day at 5 in the morning, not because he wanted to, because 3 jobs don't wait for a man who's tired. He slept on the couch. Not because the apartment had no bedroom, it did a small one at the end of the narrow hallway, but because that room belonged to Sophie, his daughter, 7 years old, about to turn 8, and the only reason Harry got up at 5 in the morning when his body begged him to stay down. Her bedroom walls were covered in drawings, crayon houses with big gardens, bright yellow suns, and in every single picture, 3 people: a tall man, a little girl, and a woman with long hair and a wide smile. Sophie still drew her mother in every picture. 3 years after Grace was gone, her daughter still made room for her in every world she imagined. Harry would stand in the doorway some mornings looking at those drawings before the sun came up, and he'd feel something twist deep in his chest, something between gratitude and grief that he never quite learned to name. Grace had been sick for 14 months before she died. Lung cancer, the kind that doesn't negotiate. Harry had worked doubles, triples, sold the car, borrowed money he couldn't pay back, all to keep her in treatment 1 more month, 1 more week, 1 more day. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough, and some part of him knew that, but knowing didn't stop him from trying. The night before she passed, Grace held Sophie's hand in the hospital bed. Her voice was thin, barely louder than the hum of the machines, but her eyes were bright, fiercely bright, the way they always got when she was making a promise she intended to keep. "Every birthday," she told Sophie, "I want you to have the most beautiful cake. Can you promise, Mommy, you'll always blow out your candles real hard?" Sophie had nodded, her small face serious. "I promise, Mommy." Harry stood in the corner of the room with his back against the wall. He bit down on his lip until he tasted iron. He knew what Grace was really doing. She was saying goodbye in a language a 5-year-old could carry without breaking. After Grace died, Harry kept the promise. The first year, he bought a small sheet cake from the grocery store and decorated it himself with canned frosting and gummy bears. Sophie blew out 6 candles and laughed so hard she nearly fell off her chair. The second year, he saved enough for a real cake from the bakery down the street, white frosting, pink flowers, her name written in purple script. Sophie told everyone at school about it for a week. The third year last year, he managed a 2-tier cake with buttercream roses. Sophie stared at it like it was a crown. But this year was different. Sophie was turning 8. And one evening, about 6 months before her birthday, she was sitting on the couch watching television when a commercial came on, a slow golden shot of a towering castle cake, layers of pale blue and white edible flowers cascading down the sides like a waterfall in a fairy tale. "Daddy, look," she whispered. "It's like a real castle." She didn't ask for it. She just watched, her eyes wide, her lips slightly parted. Then the commercial ended, and she went back to her coloring book, and that was that. But Harry remembered. He looked up the bakery that night after Sophie fell asleep. Sweet Heritage, the signature collection. The cake was called the Enchanted Castle. $389 before tax, $419 after. Harry stared at the number on his phone screen for a long time. Then he got up, walked to the kitchen, and took an empty glass jar from the cabinet. He set it on the counter next to the framed photo of Grace. That was the night he started saving. Every tip from washing cars went into the jar. Every extra dollar from weekend deliveries. He skipped lunch 3 days a week, packed water from home instead of buying it. He picked up late-night shifts, delivering packages when Sophie was asleep, and the neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, could listen for her through the thin apartment walls. The jar filled slowly. Some days he dropped in $3. Some days 5. Some days just a handful of quarters and dimes that clinked against the glass like tiny bells. There were weeks when the jar barely moved, when the car needed a repair, or Sophie needed new shoes, or the electric bill came in higher than expected. Those weeks Harry would sit at the kitchen table after midnight, staring at the jar, doing the math in his head, wondering if he'd make it in time. He always found a way. An extra shift here, a canceled haircut there, small sacrifices that nobody noticed except the man making them. He never counted the money in front of Sophie. He'd wait until she was in bed, then sit at the kitchen table under the low light, stacking coins into neat towers, adding up the bills, writing the total on a slip of paper he kept folded inside the jar. 1 week before Sophie's birthday, Harry sat at that table one last time. He counted everything, $357 in bills tucked into a white envelope, $80 in coins still in the jar, $437 total. The enchanted castle cost $419 after tax. He had enough, $18 to spare. Harry leaned back in his chair and smiled. It was a small smile, quiet, almost private, the kind of smile a man allows himself when he's been holding his breath for half a year and finally gets to exhale. He looked at Grace's photo on the counter. "I got it, baby," he whispered. "She's getting her castle." The morning he went to the bakery, Harry put on the best clothes he owned. A pair of jeans, faded but clean. A dark work jacket with a small tear on the left cuff that he'd sewn shut himself. Shoes that had seen better days but were polished as well as shoe polish could manage. He shaved, carefully combed his hair, and looked at himself in the bathroom mirror. He picked up the jar, slipped the envelope into his chest pocket, and headed for the door. Sophie came running from her room barefoot and wrapped her arms around his leg. "Daddy, where are you going?" He knelt down. "I'm going to get your surprise baby girl." Her face lit up. "The surprise, really?" "Really?" He kissed her forehead. "You be good for Mrs. Patterson, okay? Daddy will be back soon." On the bus ride across town, Harry held the jar on his lap with both hands. He watched the neighborhoods change through the window, the laundromat on 5th, the check-cashing place on Broad, then the tree-lined streets with wrought-iron fences, then the shops with names he couldn't pronounce selling things he'd never buy. The further the bus went, the wider the streets got, and the quieter the people became. By the time he stepped off at Westfield, he was the only passenger left. Harry thought he was ready. Sweet Heritage's Westfield location sat on the corner of a wide boulevard lined with luxury boutiques and organic coffee shops. The storefront was all glass and warm light golden chandeliers, fresh flowers on the counter cakes displayed behind spotless cases like jewelry in a museum. The air inside smelled like butter and vanilla and money. Harry pushed through the front door. A small bell chimed above him. Several customers glanced up from their tables, women in tailored coats, men in pressed shirts, and their eyes moved over him the way eyes do when they've already decided something. A quick scan top to bottom, the jacket, the shoes, the jar, then away. Harry walked toward the display counter. On the wall behind it, a polished brass plaque caught his eye. "Every customer deserves dignity, founded by James Carter." Beside it hung a black and white photograph of an older black woman smiling next to a small wooden cart stacked with cakes. A small inscription read, "Ruth Carter, 1952 to 2021, where it all began." Harry glanced at the photo briefly, then turned his attention to the counter. A young man stood behind the register, early 20s, sandy brown hair, name tag reading Derek. He looked up and offered a genuine smile. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you?" Harry set the jar on the counter. "I'd like to see the Enchanted Castle cake from the Signature Collection." Before Derek could respond, a woman appeared from the back office. Tall, blonde, immaculate, her name tag read, "Ashley Morgan, Store Manager." Her eyes swept over Harry in one practiced motion, the faded jacket, the worn shoes, the glass jar of coins sitting on her pristine marble counter. Something shifted behind her expression. Not hostility. Something worse. Certainty. "The signature collection starts at $350, Ashley said, stepping in front of Derek. Her voice was pleasant, polished, perfectly calibrated. "We also have our express line on the other side of the store, much more accessible price range. Would you like me to show you?" Harry met her eyes. "I know the price. I'd like the Enchanted Castle, $389. Ashley raised one eyebrow. She didn't reach for a catalog. Instead, she recited the details slowly, each word placed with care. "The Enchanted Castle, $389 before tax. $419 after. We accept credit cards and wire transfers." Harry placed the white envelope beside the jar. "I'm paying cash. $437. That's enough." Ashley looked at the jar of coins. She looked at the envelope. She did not reach for either. "Sir, we have a store policy," she said. "We don't accept loose coins as payment for large orders. I'd suggest exchanging them at a bank and coming back." Harry kept his voice even. "The envelope has $357 in bills. That alone nearly covers the cake. And coins are legal tender." Ashley's smile didn't waver. "That's our policy, sir." There was no such policy. They both knew it. Everyone at the counter knew it. Derek shifted his weight behind the register. "Ashley, I think we could just—" She turned. One look, sharp enough to cut. "Derek, go check on the beverage station." Derek closed his mouth. His jaw tightened, but he stepped back. Harry stood still. His hand rested on the jar. He did not raise his voice. He did not look away. "I'll wait," he said. Around the shop, conversations had stopped. A woman near the window whispered something to her companion. A man in a gray suit studied his phone with sudden intensity. In the far corner, an older woman, white-haired, mid-70s, elegant in a way that had nothing to do with her clothes, lowered her teacup and watched the scene unfold over the rim of her glasses. Her name was Helen Parker, and she had been coming to this bakery every Saturday morning for 3 years. Ashley reached for the phone behind the counter and dialed building security. Her voice stayed perfectly composed. "Yes, we have a customer causing a disturbance. Could you send someone over?" Harry heard every word. He didn't flinch. He stood there the way a man stands when he has practiced stillness his whole life, when he has learned through years of being watched and judged and underestimated that the quietest person in the room is often the strongest. He was not standing there for himself. He was standing there for Sophie, and for a promise made in a hospital room by a woman who couldn't keep it herself. The security guard arrived 2 minutes later, a broad-shouldered man in a dark uniform who filled the doorway like he'd been built specifically for it. He looked at Harry, then at Ashley, reading the situation the way men in his profession learn to fast surface level and usually wrong. Ashley spoke first. "This gentleman has been asked to leave and has refused. He's making our other customers uncomfortable." The guard turned to Harry. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step outside." Harry didn't raise his voice. He didn't shift his weight. He looked at the guard the way a man looks at a wall he's seen before something solid and predictable that he's long since learned how to stand in front of without flinching. "I'm a customer," he said. "I came to buy a cake. My money is on the counter." The guard glanced at the jar of coins at the white envelope. He hesitated. There was nothing threatening about the man in front of him. No raised voice, no clenched fists. Just a man standing very still with his hand resting on a glass jar. Ashley pressed harder. "He's disrupting the store. Other customers are leaving." It was true that 2 women near the window had gathered their things and walked out, but whether they left because of Harry or because of what they'd witnessed Ashley do to him was a question no one in the room was ready to answer. The guard took a half step forward. "Sir, if you could just—" A voice cut through from the far corner of the bakery. "I've been sitting here for 20 minutes. Helen Parker rose from her chair. She moved slowly the way women of her age move when they want every step to count. She crossed the shop floor, set her teacup on the counter with a soft clink, and looked directly at Ashley. I've watched this man stand here with more grace than anyone in this room, including you. He asked for a cake. He offered to pay. And you called security." Helen's voice was quiet, but carried the kind of authority that doesn't come from volume. It comes from 70-some years of watching people and knowing exactly what she's seeing. "So I'd like to know, are you refusing to serve him because of the coins or because of something else?" The question landed in the silence like a stone in still water. No one moved. Ashley's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The security guard took a step back. Helen turned to Harry. "Don't you go anywhere," she said. "I'll stand right here with you." Harry looked at her. This woman he'd never met, who owed him nothing, who had simply decided that what was happening in front of her was not acceptable. His eyes burned, but he held steady. He gave her a small nod. And then Ashley played her last card. She leaned forward, just slightly, and spoke in a voice low enough that only Harry and Helen could hear. The kind of voice people use when they want to wound without leaving fingerprints. "Sir, if you really loved your daughter, you wouldn't put her through the embarrassment of a cake bought with pocket change." The words hit Harry in a place he didn't know was still exposed. Not his pride, he'd built walls around that a long time ago. It hit the thing beneath the pride. The fear he carried every single day but never spoke aloud that he wasn't enough. That no matter how many shifts he worked, how many meals he skipped, how many promises he kept, Sophie deserved better than what he could give. His hand moved to the jar, his fingers curled around the glass. For the first time all morning, his grip faltered. He looked down at the coins, quarters, and dimes and nickels that represented 6 months of overtime, 6 months of packed water bottles and skipped lunches and late-night deliveries, and for one terrible moment, they looked small. They looked like exactly what Ashley wanted them to look like, not enough. He almost picked up the jar. He almost turned and walked out. Then his phone buzzed in his pocket. A voice message from Sophie sent from Mrs. Patterson's number, her little voice bright and breathless. "Daddy, I'm waiting for the surprise. I love you so much." Harry closed his eyes. He drew one long breath, the kind that starts at the bottom of the lungs and fills everything. When he opened his eyes, his hand was back on the jar, not lifting it, pressing it down. "I'll wait," he said again, and this time the words were made of iron. While Harry stood at the counter and Ashley retreated to the phone to make another call she hoped would solve her problem. Derek slipped into the back hallway. His hands were shaking. His mouth was dry. He was 22 years old, earning minimum wage, carrying $38,000 in student loans, and he was about to do something that could cost him the only job he had. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a number he'd never dialed, the internal incident hotline, a direct line to the CEO's office that James Carter had set up for employees to report exactly this kind of thing. Derek had memorized the number during orientation. He'd never imagined he'd use it. He pressed call. It rang twice. A deep voice answered Carter. Derek's voice came out faster than he intended. "Mr. Carter, this is Derek at the Westfield location. There's a customer here, a man trying to buy a cake. He has the money, but Ashley, Ms. Morgan, she won't serve him. She made up a policy about coins. She called security. Sir, I think it's because of—" He swallowed hard. "I think it's because of how he looks." The line went silent for 3 seconds. Then James Carter spoke low and flat and absolutely certain, "I'm on my way." James Carter was in the back seat of a black sedan, 12 minutes from a board meeting that had taken his team 3 weeks to prepare when he told his driver to turn around. He canceled a meeting worth several $1 million in pending decisions with a single text message and leaned back in his seat as the car reversed course toward Westfield. Through the window, the city scrolled past, but James wasn't seeing the city. He was seeing a bakery in the south side of Chicago. 1976. He was 9 years old, and his mother's hand was warm around his. Ruth Carter wore her best dress, a blue cotton thing she'd ironed twice that morning, and in her other hand, she carried an envelope. 1 month's wages from cleaning rooms at the Morrison Hotel. Enough she'd calculated for a real birthday cake from a real bakery for the first time in James's life. They walked through the front door together. The shop smelled like sugar and butter and everything good. James remembered pressing his face against the display case, his breath fogging the glass, staring at a chocolate cake with roses made of frosting. The manager approached, a tall man with a thin smile. He looked at Ruth's dress, at her shoes, at the way she clutched the envelope, and he said, not unkindly, which made it worse, "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at another establishment." Ruth didn't argue. She didn't make a scene. She squeezed James's hand, turned around, and walked out. She didn't say a word the entire walk home, but James, looking up at his mother from the height of a 9-year-old, saw her wipe her eyes with the back of her hand when she thought he wasn't watching. That night, Ruth baked a cake in their tiny kitchen. It came out lopsided, the frosting uneven, one side slightly burned. She wrote on it in shaky cursive, "Happy birthday, my king." James ate 3 slices. He told her it was the best cake he'd ever had. And later, lying in bed staring at the ceiling, he made a promise, the kind of promise a child makes with the full, unquestioning force of a heart that hasn't yet learned what impossible means. "I'm going to build a bakery, Mama, and nobody will ever be turned away." He kept that promise. A food cart at 23, a small storefront at 29, 40 stores across 12 states by 55, Sweet Heritage Bakery, and in every single one a brass plaque on the wall, a photograph of Ruth beside a wooden cart, and 5 words that were not a slogan, but an oath: "Every customer deserves dignity." Ruth Carter died 3 years ago. She lived long enough to see the first store open. She stood in the doorway and cried, and she told her son, "You did it, baby." James still carried her photograph in his wallet. The car pulled up to the Westfield location. James straightened his tie. He walked through the rear entrance and stopped in the back hallway, looking through the glass panel into the shop floor. He saw Harry standing at the counter, hand on a glass jar, back straight. And behind the register, Ashley Morgan, arms folded, chin lifted. James didn't see a stranger. He saw his mother. Ruth Carter, 50 years ago, standing in a bakery with an envelope full of hard-earned money, being told she didn't belong. The floor was different. The city was different. But the look on the man's face, that quiet, unbreakable dignity, holding itself together by sheer will, was exactly the same. James Carter walked onto the floor. "What's going on here?" His voice carried the calm of a man who already knew the answer. Ashley recognized him instantly. The color drained from her face. "Mr. Carter, this customer, he wanted to pay in coins, and our policy—" James cut her off. "What policy? Show me the document." Ashley's mouth worked, but no words followed. There was no document, there was no policy. James turned to Harry. "Sir, which cake would you like?" Harry looked at this man, silver-haired, dressed in a dark suit, radiating authority, and recognized nothing about him except the way he asked the question directly, without pity, without performance. Like he was talking to a customer. Just a customer. "The Enchanted Castle," Harry said. $389 before tax. James nodded and turned to Derek, who had returned to the register. "Derek, count the money and process the order." Derek opened the envelope first, $357 in bills laid flat and neat. Then the jar he counted, carefully sorting coins into stacks on the counter. $80 exactly. 437 total. The cake after tax came to 419. Derek looked up at James. $18 over, sir." James turned back to Ashley. His voice was level, but every word carried weight. $18 over. "Would you like to explain again why this man couldn't afford the cake?" Ashley said nothing. Her eyes dropped to the floor. James faced Harry. His tone shifted, still direct but softer now, carrying something that sounded less like authority and more like recognition. "Mr. Reed, I owe you an apology. What happened here today does not represent this company or its values. Please allow me to offer this cake free of charge as a gesture of—" Harry shook his head. "No, I don't need a gift, sir. I didn't come here for charity. I came to buy a cake for my daughter's birthday, and I have the money to pay for it." He tapped the envelope on the counter. "I just want to be treated like a customer." James looked at him for a long moment, and what he saw, what settled into his chest like a stone, was something he understood better than perhaps anyone else in that room. The refusal wasn't pride. It wasn't stubbornness. It was the same thing Ruth Carter carried out of that bakery in 1976, the bone-deep knowledge that dignity is not something you accept as a gift because it was never anyone else's to give. "You're right," James said quietly. "Derek processed the full payment?" Derek rang up the order. $419. He counted out the bills the coins, handed Harry his change $18, and printed the receipt. Harry folded the receipt, slipped it into his chest pocket next to the now empty envelope, and shook Derek's hand. "Thank you," he said. He shook James's hand next. Then he turned and nodded to Helen Parker, who was still standing by the counter, her teacup untouched and cold. "Thank you, ma'am," Harry said, "for standing with me." Helen smiled. "You didn't need me, sweetheart, but I'm glad I was here." James walked Harry to the door. "The cake will be ready in 2 hours. My team will prepare it personally." Harry stepped out into the sunlight. He pulled out his phone and called Mrs. Patterson. "The cake will be ready at 4, he told her. "Sophie's going to have the best birthday yet." He thought the hard part was over. He was wrong. After James left the store with instructions, "Prepare the cake perfectly. We'll discuss the rest later." Ashley stood alone in the back preparation room. The door was closed. Her hands were steady, but something behind her eyes was not. She was going to lose her job. She knew that. The moment James Carter walked through that door, her time at Sweet Heritage was measured in hours, not years. 4 years of early mornings, perfect quarterly reviews, a flawless customer satisfaction record gone, because of a man with a jar of coins. That's how she framed it in her mind. Not because of what she'd done, because of him. She looked at the order slip pinned to the board Enchanted Castle. Name Sophie, pick up 4 o'clock. Ashley was the store's lead decorator. The Enchanted Castle was her specialty. She'd made dozens of them, each one pristine, each one a small masterpiece of buttercream and fondant. She could make one blindfolded. She could also make one wrong. The name came out Lila instead of Sophie. A single letter, easy to call an honest mistake. The frosting on the left tower was uneven, slightly thick on one side. The cascading flowers, which normally descended in a perfect gradient from lavender to white, were jumbled purples mixed with pinks, spacing irregular. The base tier leaned almost imperceptibly to the right. It was still a beautiful cake. To an untrained eye, it might even pass. But anyone who had ever seen a real Enchanted Castle, anyone who knew what $419 was supposed to buy, would see the difference immediately. Derek saw it. He stood in the doorway of the prep room watching Ashley box the cake, and his stomach dropped. "Ashley, the name, it says Lila. The order says Sophie." Ashley didn't look up. "Autocorrect in my head. It happens." Derek opened his mouth to push further, but Ashley straightened and fixed him with a look that had nothing pleasant left in it. "If you report me again," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'll tell HR you've been skimming product. Your word against mine. Want to guess who they'll believe, the manager of 4 years or the part-time college kid?" Derek closed his mouth. His hands balled into fists at his sides. He said nothing. Ashley sealed the box and carried it to the pickup counter. At 4 o'clock, Harry returned. Derek handed him the box. Harry lifted the lid and looked inside. He saw the name first, Lila, not Sophie. Then the frosting uneven rushed. The flowers scattered without care. The slight lean of the base. He stared at it for 5 seconds. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved from the cake to Derek, who stood behind the counter looking like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the air. Harry knew. This was not an accident. Mistakes don't target specific letters in a child's name. Mistakes don't happen to every element of a cake at once. But Harry didn't say a word. He closed the box, tucked it under his arm, and looked at Derek. "Thank you," he said. The same 2 words, the same steady voice. Then he walked out. Derek watched him go. The bell above the door chimed softly, and then Harry was gone. In his car, a 15-year-old sedan with a cracked dashboard and a passenger seat held together with duct tape, Harry set the cake box on the seat beside him. He gripped the steering wheel with both hands. He sat there in the parking lot, engine off, windows up. He thought about Sophie's face when she'd see the cake. She wouldn't notice the name. She was 7, almost 8. She'd be too excited to read the letters carefully. She probably wouldn't notice the frosting either, or the lean, or the flowers. She'd see a castle and she'd scream with joy, and that would be enough. But Harry would know. He'd know that the cake his daughter was blowing out candles on was a message, a final petty act of contempt from a woman who looked at him and saw nothing worth respecting. He leaned forward, rested his forehead on the steering wheel, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, longer than the funeral, longer than the first night alone, longer than any of the quiet, grinding days that followed, Harry cried. Not loud, not dramatic, just tears falling onto his work jacket, onto his hands, onto the steering wheel of a car that barely ran. "Grace," he whispered, "I tried, I swear I tried." He sat there until the tears stopped. Then he wiped his face, started the engine, and drove home. Because that's what Harry Reid did. He kept going. Back at the bakery, Helen Parker was still there. She had watched Harry open the box. She had seen the cake from across the counter, and Helen Parker had bought enough enchanted castles for her grandchildren to know exactly what one was supposed to look like. What she saw in that box was not it. She watched Harry leave without complaining. She watched him walk out with the same quiet dignity he'd carried in, and something in her chest tightened, the particular kind of anger that comes not from being wronged yourself, but from watching someone else be wronged and knowing they're too tired to fight anymore. Helen picked up her phone and scrolled to a name she hadn't called in months. James Carter's personal number, she'd known him for years, had been one of the first investors in Sweet Heritage when it was still a single storefront in a strip mall. He answered on the second ring. "James," she said, and her voice was steel wrapped in silk. "I'm at the Westfield store. That man's cake, the one your people just handed him, was deliberately ruined. I saw it with my own eyes. The name was wrong. The decoration was sloppy. That woman did it on purpose." On the other end of the line, James Carter went very still. 10 seconds of silence. Then he said 2 words to his driver. "Turn around." James Carter walked into the security office at the Westfield location without knocking. The guard on duty looked up, startled. James didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. His face was on the wall of every Sweet Heritage in the country. "Pull up the prep room camera," James said. "Last 3 hours." The guard brought up the footage on the main monitor. James leaned forward, hands flat on the desk, and watched. He watched Ashley enter the preparation room alone. He watched her pull the order slip from the board and read it. He watched her pick up the piping bag. And then he watched her write Lila, not Sophie, in careful, deliberate strokes across the top of the enchanted castle. There was no hesitation, no correction, no second glance at the order slip pinned 2 feet from her hand. She knew the name. She chose to write it wrong. He watched her rush the frosting on the left tower, thick, uneven passes where her hands normally moved with surgical precision. He watched her scatter the cascading flowers, without pattern purples crashing into pinks, spacing that a first-year decorator would have been ashamed of. He watched her tilt the base tier by pressing one side with her palm, a gesture so small it almost looked like an accident, except that Ashley Morgan didn't make accidents. Not in 4 years. Then James watched the pickup. He watched Harry lift the lid and look inside. He watched the man's jaw tighten a tiny movement barely visible on camera, and he watched Harry close the box without a word. He watched him say, "Thank you," to Derek. He watched him walk out the door. James closed his eyes. Behind the darkness, he saw his mother. Ruth Carter, in her blue cotton dress, walking out of a bakery in 1976, with her head held high and her hand trembling around her son's fingers. She hadn't complained either. She'd said thank you, too, because that's what people do when they've been broken so many times that silence becomes the only armor they have left. He opened his eyes and picked up his phone. The purchase receipt was still in the system. Harry Reid. Phone number attached to the order. It rang 4 times before Harry answered. His voice was flat-guarded, the voice of a man who doesn't expect good news from unknown numbers. "Mr. Reid, this is James Carter. I'm calling about the cake you picked up today." James kept his voice steady, though the footage was still frozen on the monitor in front of him, the frame of Harry walking away. "I know it wasn't right, and I know why." Harry was quiet on the other end. Then softly, "The cake is fine, sir?" "No," James said. "It's not fine. I reviewed the security footage. What was done to that cake was deliberate. And you deserve better than that. Your daughter deserves better." The line was silent. James could hear the faint sound of a car engine idling. James continued. "I'd like to personally deliver a new cake to your home. The cake you paid for the real one. Not charity, not a gift. The product you purchased made the way it should have been made from the beginning. I've already called our downtown location. They're preparing an enchanted castle right now." Harry didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was thicker than before. "You don't have to do that, Mr. Carter." "I know I don't have to," James said. "But it's the right thing, and I should have made sure it was done right the first time." He took down Harry's address. 2 hours later, Ashley Morgan sat in the back office of the Westfield store. The security footage was playing on the laptop in front of her. James Carter stood on the other side of the desk, arms at his sides. "Explain," he said. Ashley stared at the screen. The video showed her writing Lila in white buttercream, her hand steady, her face blank. She shook her head slowly. "It was a mistake. I must have misread the—" "Don't." James's voice didn't rise. It dropped. It became the kind of quiet that presses against the walls of a room. "I've watched you decorate 500 cakes in 4 years. You don't misread names. You don't rush frosting. And you don't tilt a base tier with your palm by accident." Ashley's mouth closed. Her hands were folded in her lap, and James noticed they were shaking. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, not softer exactly, but heavier, like a man lifting something he'd carried for a very long time. "I built this company because of my mother," he said. "Her name was Ruth. She cleaned hotel rooms for 23 years. When I was 9, she took me to a bakery to buy my first real birthday cake. She'd saved for months. She wore her best dress. And the manager looked at her and told her she'd be more comfortable somewhere else." Ashley's eyes were fixed on the desk. "My mother walked out of that store without a word," James continued. "She went home and baked me a lopsided cake with burned edges and wrote, 'Happy birthday, my king,' in frosting she could barely afford. And I swore that I would build a place where that would never happen to anyone again." He leaned forward. "That plaque on the wall out there, that's not marketing. That's a promise I made to a woman who died believing I'd keep it. And today in my own store under that plaque, you made me break it." Ashley's composure cracked. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in movies. It cracked the way real things crack slowly and from the inside. Her chin trembled, her eyes filled. And when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My mother cleaned offices," she said. 3 different buildings. We lived in a 1-bedroom in Garfield Park. I wore second-hand clothes to school every day, and kids called me—" She stopped, drew a breath. "I worked so hard to get out of that, to become someone people respected when I walked into a room, and somewhere along the way I forgot what it felt like to be on the other side of the counter." James watched her. He let the words settle in the room like dust after something has fallen. "I understand that," he said finally. "And I'm sorry for what you went through. But understanding where cruelty comes from doesn't excuse it. That man saved for 6 months to buy his daughter a birthday cake. He stood in this store and took everything you threw at him without raising his voice. And when you handed him a cake you deliberately ruined, he said thank you and walked out, because he didn't know what else to do." James stood. "You're terminated, effective immediately. Not for the coins, for the cake, for what you did when you thought no one was watching." Ashley nodded. She didn't argue. She picked up her things and walked out of the office, and the door clicked shut behind her with the softest possible sound. James called Derek in next. The young man stood in the doorway, rigid, still expecting to be fired himself for making that phone call. "Derek," James said, "you called me today when no one else would. You could have lost your job. Why did you do it?" Derek's shoulders dropped slightly. "Because he reminded me of my dad," he said. "My father worked 2 jobs to put me through school, washed dishes at night, drove a delivery van during the day, and I kept thinking if somebody treated my dad like that, I'd want someone in the room to pick up the phone." James nodded slowly. "Starting Monday, you're the new store manager of this location." Derek blinked. "Sir, I'm part-time. I'm still in school." "We'll work out the schedule," James said. "What I need is someone who understands what that plaque on the wall means. You showed me today that you do." At 6:30 that evening, a black sedan pulled up in front of a small apartment building on the east side of the city. James Carter stepped out carrying a white box larger than the last one tied with a gold ribbon. Inside was an enchanted castle from the downtown location. Towers perfectly straight, frosting smooth as glass, cascading flowers flowing from lavender to white in a flawless gradient. And across the top, in elegant script, "Happy Birthday, Sophie." Harry opened the door. He looked at the box, then at James. For a moment, neither man spoke. "Mr. Reed," James said, "this is the cake you paid for, made correctly." Harry took the box. He held it carefully, the way a man holds something that weighs more than its contents. Behind him, the apartment was small drawings taped to every wall, a couch with a folded blanket and pillow, a kitchen counter with a framed photograph of a woman who smiled like she knew a secret. James saw all of it. He said nothing about it. "Mr. Reed, if you ever need anything at all, here's my card." He held it out. Harry took the card, slipped it into his chest pocket, and extended his hand. James shook it. 2 men standing in a doorway, understanding each other without needing to say why. James turned to leave, then stopped. He looked back. "Your daughter is lucky to have you." Harry swallowed hard. "I'm the lucky one," he said. That night, the apartment smelled like buttercream and birthday candles. Harry had hung streamers from the ceiling, blue and silver, Sophie's favorite colors, and blown up a dozen balloons by hand until his cheeks ached. Mrs. Patterson from next door brought paper plates, a jug of lemonade, and a hand-drawn birthday card she'd made herself. 2 of Sophie's friends from school came over their mothers, dropping them off with small wrapped gifts and warm smiles. The apartment was tiny, and with 5 people in it, the walls nearly touched everyone's elbows. But it didn't matter. It was full in the way that Grace would have wanted it to be. When Sophie walked out of her bedroom and saw the cake on the table, the enchanted castle towers gleaming under the kitchen light, her name written in perfect script across the top, she stopped in the doorway. Her hands flew to her mouth. Her eyes went wide, then wider, then spilled over. "Daddy, it's the castle from TV." She ran to him, and Harry caught her lifting her up, holding her tight against his chest. She buried her face in his neck and laughed the kind of laugh that doesn't know anything about 6-month savings plans or overnight security shifts or glass jars full of coins, the kind of laugh that only knows it is loved. "Daddy, you're the best daddy in the whole entire world," she whispered. Harry closed his eyes. He pressed his face against his daughter's hair and felt something release inside him, something he'd been holding since a hospital room 3 years ago, since a woman's thin voice said, "Every birthday," and he nodded because he couldn't speak. Sophie blew out 8 candles. She blew hard the way her mother told her to. On the kitchen counter behind the cake, Grace's photograph caught the light. She was smiling. A year later, a small bakery opened on Greenfield Avenue, 3 blocks from Harry Reed's apartment. It wasn't much a narrow storefront with a hand-painted sign above the door that read, "Grace's Kitchen." The walls inside were the color of warm honey, and the display case held simple cakes, vanilla, chocolate, lemon, carrot. Nothing that would make a magazine cover. But everything was made with the kind of care that turns ordinary things into something worth remembering. Harry taught himself to bake from library books and late-night videos, failing dozens of times before getting it right. His lemon cake became the neighborhood favorite. People came from 3 zip codes away for it. On the wall beside the register, a small wooden sign was mounted at eye level. Burned into the wood in plain letters were the words, "If you have coins, you have enough. M.R." Derek, who was now running the Westfield Sweet Heritage and finishing his business degree, stopped by Grace's kitchen most Saturdays. He always brought a box of surplus ingredients, flour, sugar, vanilla extract, and he always stayed for a cup of coffee and a conversation about nothing in particular. James Carter had quietly arranged a small business loan through a foundation he funded. No special terms, no charity, just the standard rate available to any new business owner. Harry paid it back on time every month without missing a single payment. Helen Parker came in every Saturday morning. She ordered the same thing, a cup of Earl Grey, and whatever Sophie recommended from the display case, which changed weekly depending on what the girl felt like eating. Helen always sat at the same corner table, and Sophie always joined her for 10 minutes before school, chattering about her drawings and her friends and the book she was reading. Sophie still drew pictures with 3 people, a tall man, a little girl, and a woman with long hair and a wide smile. But now the drawings had something new, a small bakery in the background with a sign on the door. And in the corner of every picture, sitting at a table with a tiny cup, was an older woman wearing glasses. Harry Reid never told anyone what happened in that bakery. He didn't post it online. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't ask for anything more than what he'd already paid for. He went home, set the cake on the table, and held his daughter. But the story traveled the way true stories do, through Helen, who told her friends, through Derek, who told his family, through James Carter, who told his board of directors. And from that day forward, every new employee at Sweet Heritage Bakery completed a training program before their first shift. It was called the Jar of Coins. And if you walk into the Westfield location today, you'll find the brass plaque still hanging on the wall, Ruth Carter's photograph still beside it. But next to them now, in a simple black frame, is a new image, a glass jar filled with coins catching the light, with a single line of text beneath it. A jar of coins is not a measure of what a man can afford. It is a measure of what a father is willing to sacrifice. That is all that needs to be said.